She laughed first. That's the detail nobody in that courtroom will ever forget. Not the verdict, not the gasps, not the sound of a marriage finally ending. They'll remember that Camille Delacroix laughed first, a bright, tinkling sound that echoed off the marble walls of a Manhattan courtroom. Right before she looked the plainly dressed woman in the defendant's chair up and down and said, loud enough for the entire gallery to hear, I almost feel sorry for you, sweetheart. Must be humiliating, losing a husband like Julian to someone who actually knows how to dress for a room like this. Wren Ashworth said nothing. She simply folded her hands in her lap, the way she always did, and let the silence sit there like a held breath. What nobody in that courtroom understood, not the mistress smirking in her front row seat, not the husband adjusting his cufflinks at the plaintiff's table, was that in exactly 11 minutes, a judge was going to open a single sealed folder and change the meaning of every word Camille Delacroix had just said. Welcome back. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from tonight. And drop a like if stories about quiet people holding all the cards are your favorite kind. Because tonight's story is exactly that. Stay with me, because what happens in this courtroom is going to be one of the most satisfying reversals I've ever told you. Let's go back to the beginning, because the woman sitting quietly in that defendant's chair did not start out quiet by accident. She built it deliberately, the way some people build fortunes and others build walls. Wren Calloway grew up the only child of a reclusive investment strategist named Harold Calloway, a man who had spent 4 decades building something so vast and so deliberately invisible that most of Wall Street didn't know his name, let alone the true scale of what he controlled. The Calloway Meridian Trust wasn't listed on any public exchange. It didn't sponsor galas or put its name on hospital wings. It quietly held controlling stakes in dozens of companies across banking, shipping, and technology, threading through the American economy like roots under a lawn nobody thought to dig up. Harold had raised his daughter with one governing principle drilled into her from the time she could read a balance sheet, which was earlier than most children learned to ride a bicycle. Money reveals people. Not the having of it. The proximity to it. Show someone a fortune before they've shown you their character, and you will never actually know who they are. Only who they became the instant they smelled the money in the room. So when Wren turned 22 and inherited functional control of the trust following her father's sudden death, she made a decision that would shape the next decade of her life. She would keep the inheritance locked behind layers of holding companies and nominee trustees, so complete that even her own accountants filed under a different family name for public-facing work. She would live modestly, work an ordinary job, and see, once and for all, whether anyone could ever love the plain version of her before they loved the number attached to her name. Her father had left her something else besides the trust, a worn leather notebook he'd kept for decades, filled with small, precise observations about the people who had passed through his life over the years, colleagues, partners, a handful of friends who had known him before the money made friendship complicated. Wren read it cover to cover the month after his funeral, and one entry, dated some 15 years before her own birth, stayed with her longer than any other. He had written it after a young associate at his first firm turned down a lucrative opportunity to instead help a struggling coworker meet a deadline, at real cost to his own advancement. The entry read simply, "Character reveals itself fastest in the moments nobody is keeping score. I intend to spend the rest of my life paying closer attention to those moments than to anything printed on a resume." Wren had underlined it twice and carried the notebook with her into every apartment she lived in afterward. A compass for a life she was determined to build on her own terms rather than the ones her inheritance made effortless. She became a rare manuscripts appraiser at a small auction house in the village, a job she'd actually trained for and loved, the kind of quiet, precise work that suited a woman who had spent her whole childhood learning to read what was real underneath what merely looked valuable. It was there, cataloging a private collection for a client 3 years into her new invisible life, that she met Julian Ashworth. Julian was 31 then, ambitious, charming in the specific way of men who have decided charm is simply another tool in a toolbox, and just beginning to build what would become Ashworth Capital, a boutique investment firm he was determined to turn into an empire. He was standing in the client's library that day negotiating the sale of a first edition set his uncle had left him, and he noticed Wren before he noticed the manuscripts, which she would later admit was the first thing about him that charmed her completely. He courted her the old-fashioned way, Or so it seemed. Dinners at unpretentious restaurants because he told her he liked that she never once asked to be taken somewhere expensive. Long walks instead of car service. A proposal 18 months later, on a park bench rather than anywhere that would have made the society pages. Wren married him believing, for the first time in her adult life, that she had found someone who loved the plain version of her completely, and for the first several years of their marriage, that belief held. What she didn't fully understand yet, because ambition this patient is difficult to see from the inside of a marriage, was that Julian's affection for her modesty was never really about her modesty at all. It was about how well it suited a man who needed, in those early building years, a wife who didn't ask expensive questions, didn't require expensive attention, and left him every spare hour and every spare dollar to pour into Ashworth Capital. Julian built that company on ambition, and more than he ever admitted publicly, on lines of credit extended through a series of investment vehicles he never bothered to trace back to their true source, because the terms were generous and the underwriters asked very few questions. He assumed, the way ambitious men often assume when things go suspiciously smoothly, that his own brilliance had simply attracted favorable lenders. He never once considered that the woman making his coffee every morning controlled, through 6 layers of paperwork he'd never asked to see, nearly every dollar keeping his company afloat. The cracks began the way they usually do, slowly, and then all at once. Ashworth Capital's early success made Julian a minor celebrity in finance circles by his late 30s, profiled in trade magazines, invited onto panels, courted by exactly the kind of glittering social world he had once claimed, over unpretentious dinners, to have no interest in at all. Wren watched him change with the quiet, clinical attention of someone who had spent her whole life learning to read what people became once money entered a room, and she recognized, with a grief she never fully let herself name, that she was watching her own father's warning come true in real time, just from the other side of the marriage bed. Camille Delacroix arrived at exactly the moment Julian's transformation was complete. She worked as a hospitality consultant for the same firm that managed Ashworth Capital's increasingly lavish client events, glamorous, sharp-tongued, and entirely uninterested in hiding her ambitions the way Wren had spent a decade hiding hers. Camille understood immediately, the way certain people always seem to, exactly what a man like the new Julian Ashworth wanted to hear about himself. And she said all of it, loudly, at every event where Wren stood quietly at the edges in the same handful of understated dresses she'd been wearing for years. "Your wife," Camille told him once, at a rooftop gathering 11 months before the divorce filing. Her voice pitched just low enough to feel intimate and just loud enough that Wren, 3 feet away, heard every word. "She's sweet obviously. But doesn't it ever feel like you're dragging around a museum piece? A man building what you're building needs someone who matches the room, Julian. Not someone hiding in the corner of it." Julian didn't correct her. He laughed, the specific low, complicit laugh of a man who has already decided the woman saying cruel things about his wife is more interesting than the wife herself. And something in Wren, standing close enough to hear it, closed itself off that night with a quiet, permanent finality she didn't share with anyone. She could have confronted him immediately. She could have ended things then, cleanly, before it became anything worse than a cruel comment at a party. Instead, and this was the decision that would define everything that came after, she did something far more patient. She began quietly to watch. Julian filed for divorce 9 months later, on a gray Tuesday in October, and he did it, Wren would later understand, with a specific kind of confidence that only made sense once she saw how completely he had underestimated her for over a decade. He walked into their shared apartment that evening, dropped a manila folder on the kitchen counter beside the dinner she'd made, and told her, without much preamble, that he wanted out. That he'd met someone who understood the life he was building now. That he hoped she'd be reasonable about the settlement, because his lawyers had structured things to move quickly and he had, as it happened, a very important dinner that Thursday he didn't want complicated by a drawn-out legal mess. "I'll be fair," Julian told her, straightening his tie in the hallway mirror rather than looking at her directly. "You'll get the apartment in Connecticut, a reasonable settlement, more than enough for someone with your, let's call it your modest tastes. I don't need to make this ugly, Wren. I just need it fast." Wren looked at the folder on the counter for a long moment. "Whatever you think is fair," she said quietly, and something in the flatness of her voice should have given him pause. If he had still been the kind of man who paid attention to the woman he'd married rather than the reflection of himself he saw admired everywhere else. He wasn't. He simply nodded, relieved, and left for his dinner with Camille 20 minutes later, already composing in his head the story he'd tell her about how easy the whole thing had turned out to be. What Julian didn't know, standing in that hallway congratulating himself on his own reasonableness, was that Ashworth Capital's entire credit structure, every line extended over the past 9 years, every generous term he'd never questioned, ran back through 6 layers of holding entities to a single ultimate source: the Callaway Meridian Trust. His wife's trust and divorce proceedings, once formally filed, triggered a mandatory financial disclosure process that would, within weeks, force every one of those layers into the light of a courtroom record, whether Julian Ashworth was prepared for it or not. Wren hadn't engineered his downfall. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. Even in the moments she allowed herself real anger. She hadn't planted the credit lines to trap him, hadn't manipulated the terms to punish a man who hadn't yet earned punishment when the money first started flowing. She had simply years earlier made the same decision any careful steward of a family fortune might make, quietly funding a promising venture through channels discreet enough not to complicate the personal life she was trying, however imperfectly, to build alongside it. The trap, if it could even be called that, wasn't something she built. It was something Julian had walked into with his eyes closed the moment he decided his own success was entirely his own doing, and never once thought to ask harder questions about the money that made it possible. The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a courtroom on the 11th floor of the county courthouse, a plain, high-ceilinged room with worn wooden benches and fluorescent light entirely unlike the marble and mahogany of Julian's usual world. Though he'd made sure, through his lawyers, to request one of the presiding judges known for moving high-asset cases efficiently. Judge Marsh had sat on that bench for 19 years. A woman with a reputation for reading every disclosure document personally rather than skimming her clerk's summaries, a habit that had made her simultaneously respected and mildly feared throughout the county's legal community. She arrived that morning having already reviewed the case file the night before, including a financial disclosure packet that had landed on her desk with a specific detail, flagged by her clerk in red, the kind of detail that made an experienced judge sit up a little straighter in her chair. Wren arrived early, dressed the way she'd dressed for a decade, a simple charcoal wool coat over a plain dress, her hair pulled back without any particular ceremony. She sat quietly at the defendant's table beside her attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Priscilla Odom who had represented the Callaway family's legal interests for over a decade, and who, unlike everyone else in that courtroom, understood exactly what was about to happen. Julian arrived 12 minutes later with his attorney, and, to the visible surprise of the court officers who hadn't expected a guest, Camille Delacroix on his arm, wearing a fitted crimson dress entirely unsuited to a Tuesday morning courthouse, and radiating the particular confidence of a woman who had already mentally redecorated an apartment she didn't yet own. "You didn't have to come," Julian murmured to her as they took their seats, though the pleased flush on his face said otherwise. "I wanted to see it," Camille said, not bothering to lower her voice much. "I wanted to watch you finally set yourself free." The proceedings opened with the dry procedural rhythm of every divorce hearing. Attorneys confirming filings, the judge reviewing the settlement terms Julian's team had proposed, terms that were, by any ordinary measure, generous enough that most observers in the gallery assumed this would be a short, uneventful morning. It was during a brief recess, while the judge's clerk retrieved a supplemental filing, that Camille leaned across the aisle toward Wren for the first time, unable apparently to resist one final performance for an audience she'd been waiting months to have. "I almost feel sorry for you, sweetheart," she said, her voice pitched to carry a bright, tinkling laugh escaping before she'd even finished the sentence. "Must be humiliating, losing a husband like Julian to someone who actually knows how to dress for a room like this. Do you even own anything that isn't from a clearance rack?" A ripple of uncomfortable, amused whispering moved through the gallery. Julian, to his eventual regret, said nothing to stop her, allowing himself a small, satisfied smile instead. The smile of a man watching two versions of his life be directly compared in front of witnesses and confident, entirely confident, about which one had won. Wren looked at Camille for a long moment, her expression as unreadable as it had been that night on the rooftop 11 months earlier. "You should enjoy this morning," she said quietly, no anger in her voice at all, only something that sounded, unsettlingly, like pity. "I don't think you'll enjoy the rest of your week nearly as much." Camille laughed again, delighted, mistaking the calm for defeat the same way Julian always had. "Is that a threat? From you?" "It's not a threat," Wren said. "It's just Thursday." The clerk returned then, and Judge Marsh called the proceedings back to order. And it was in this moment, with the gallery still faintly amused by the exchange they'd just witnessed, that the judge opened the sealed supplemental folder her clerk had flagged the night before. "Before I finalize any settlement terms in this matter," Judge Marsh said, her voice carrying easily through the courtroom's plain acoustics, "I want to address a disclosure that has come to the court's attention during the mandatory financial review process, one that I believe changes the framework of this entire proceeding rather significantly." Julian's attorney straightened in his chair. Julian himself glanced toward Wren's table with the first flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face, the expression of a man realizing, a half-second too late, that something he hadn't anticipated was about to enter the room. "Mr. Ashworth's counsel has proposed a settlement," the judge continued, "premised on the understanding that Mrs. Ashworth possesses limited independent assets, an understanding I note is reflected throughout the plaintiff's filings, which repeatedly characterize the defendant's financial position as, and I'm quoting directly from the proposed settlement memorandum, modest and dependent." She paused, looking up over the rim of her reading glasses. This characterization does not match what the court's mandatory disclosure process has actually revealed. The courtroom had gone very quiet. Camille's smile hadn't fallen yet, not entirely, though something uncertain had crept into the edges of it. Divorce proceedings involving assets above a certain threshold trigger a full financial disclosure requirement for both parties, Judge Marsh explained, for the benefit of the gallery as much as anyone. "This is standard, and ordinarily it simply confirms what both sides already know about each other's holdings. In this case, however, it revealed something rather more significant. Mrs. Ashworth, under her maiden name, Calloway, is the sole controlling beneficiary of the Calloway Meridian Trust, an investment entity currently holding assets in excess of $4.1 billion. She let that number settle over the room before continuing. Furthermore, court records show that Ashworth Capital, the plaintiff's own company, has operated for the past 9 years on credit lines extended, through several intermediary entities, by that same trust. Mr. Ashworth's company, in other words, has been substantially financed, from its very earliest years, by the woman his filings describe as financially dependent upon him." Julian's face had gone the color of old paper. He turned slowly toward Wren, his mouth opening without any sound coming out, the particular silence of a man watching an entire decade of assumptions collapse in real time. Camille, beside him, had stopped smiling entirely. That can't be right," she said, too loudly, drawing a sharp look from the bailiff. "She works at an auction house. She wears clearance rack dresses. This is absurd." "Ms. Delacroix," Judge Marsh said, her tone cooling several degrees, "you are not a party to these proceedings, and I'd ask you to remain silent unless addressed directly by the court." Wren sat perfectly still through all of it, her hands folded in her lap the exact way they'd been folded when Camille first leaned across the aisle to mock her, though something had shifted in her posture, a straightening, the way a person stands differently once a weight they've carried a long time is finally set down in front of witnesses rather than carried silently alone. "I'd like to clarify something for the record, Your Honor," Wren said, when the judge invited her to speak, her voice steady and carrying easily through the stunned quiet of the courtroom. "I did not hide this to manipulate my husband or to entrap him financially. I hid it because I wanted once to know whether someone could love the version of me that had nothing extraordinary to offer at all. For a long time, I believed my husband did." She glanced, briefly, toward Julian, without any real anger in her expression, only a tired, settled kind of clarity. "I understand now that what he loved wasn't the plain version of me. It was the convenience of a wife who never asked hard questions and never demanded expensive attention, because it left him free to build everything he actually cared about. I'm not angry that the money is finally visible, Your Honor. I'm relieved. I spent 11 years being underestimated in my own home. I don't especially mind being underestimated one final time this morning, in front of witnesses, before the truth simply corrects it for me." The gallery had gone entirely silent. The kind of silence that has weight, and Camille Delacroix sat frozen in her crimson dress, understanding, several seconds too late, exactly how thoroughly the last 5 minutes had rearranged the meaning of every word she'd said in that courthouse that morning. Judge Marsh set the folder down and looked directly at Julian's attorney. "Given this disclosure, the proposed settlement as filed is entirely inadequate and frankly, inappropriate given the actual balance of assets and contributions in this marriage. I'm ordering a full financial review before any settlement moves forward, and I would strongly advise your client to retain separate counsel with experience in complex asset litigation, because the terms he walked into this courtroom expecting bear very little resemblance to the terms this disclosure now requires the court to consider." A reporter for a financial trade publication, seated near the back of the gallery covering what she'd assumed would be an unremarkable morning docket, was already typing furiously into her phone before the judge had finished the sentence. By the time court recessed for the day, the story had a headline circulating among finance journalists across the city, and by the following morning, it had a name attached that made the whole thing considerably more interesting to read. The quiet heiress behind Ashworth Capital's rise, and the mistress who mocked her for it in open court. What followed in the weeks after that Thursday morning unfolded with the particular swiftness that financial ruin tends to move once its true foundation has finally been exposed to daylight. Wren, through her attorneys, made a decision that surprised even Judge Marsh, who had presided over enough bitter high-asset divorces to expect vindictiveness once the balance of power flipped this completely. She did not call in the credit lines immediately. She did not seek to bankrupt Ashworth Capital out of spite, though she could have, with a single instruction to her trustees, ended the company within a month. Instead, she gave Julian's board 30 days formal notice of a full audit and a restructured, market-rate credit agreement going forward, terms that were fair, defensible, and entirely without the generous cushioning 9 years of quiet family favor had provided. It was enough on its own to be devastating. Ashworth Capital's entire growth had been built on financing terms no ordinary lender would have offered a firm with its actual risk profile. And the moment those terms reverted to market rate, the cracks Julian had spent 9 years papering over with confidence and charm became impossible to hide from his own board. 2 major clients pulled their accounts within the first week, spooked by news of the disclosure that had, despite Wren's lawyers' best efforts at containment, leaked into financial trade circles within days. By the end of the month, Julian's own board, the same men who had spent years praising his instincts on industry panels, voted to remove him as chief executive, citing, in careful corporate language, a material failure to disclose the true nature of the company's financing structure to its own leadership. Julian did not go quietly. He called Wren repeatedly in the weeks that followed, alternating between fury and a wounded, disbelieving grief that struck her. When she finally answered on the 4th attempt, as almost sincere. "You destroyed me," he said, his voice raw in a way she hadn't heard since the earliest, gentlest years of their marriage. "You could have told me. Any time in 11 years you could have told me who you actually were." "I could have," Wren agreed quietly. "But you never once asked, Julian." "Not really. You asked what I thought of your ideas. You asked whether dinner was ready before your meetings ran late. You never once, in 11 years, asked who I actually was underneath the version of me that was convenient for you. I waited a long time for that question. It never came." She paused. "And then Camille told you I was a museum piece, dragging down the man you were trying to become. And you laughed. I think that's the moment I stopped waiting." He had no answer for that, because there wasn't one that didn't require admitting something about himself he had spent his entire adult life refusing to look at directly. Camille Delacroix's unraveling was, in its own way, even swifter than Julian's. The hospitality firm that employed her, eager to distance itself from the scandal now attached to her name across every finance gossip column in the city, quietly let her contract lapse within the month. The social circle she had spent years carefully cultivating around Julian's rising status evaporated the moment his status did, the particular brutal efficiency of a world that had never actually been interested in her, only in her proximity to money that had, it turned out, never really been his to begin with. She sent Wren exactly one message in the aftermath, not an apology, 3 clipped, resentful words. "You planned this." Wren never responded. Some accusations, she'd learned, aren't actually worth the dignity of a denial. Judge Marsh's full financial review, completed some 4 months later, resulted in a settlement that reflected, for the first time in the entire proceeding, an honest accounting of exactly what each party had actually built and actually contributed across 11 years of marriage. Wren, whose trust had financed nearly everything Julian claimed as his own singular achievement, walked away from the marriage with precisely what she'd walked into it wanting all along, which was nothing at all from him, no alimony, no claim on what remained of Ashworth Capital's assets. Only her name and her privacy, finally, fully her own again. "I don't want his money," she told Priscilla, her attorney, in the quiet aftermath of the final hearing. "I never wanted his money. I have more money than I know what to do with already. I just wanted once to walk away from something that was mine to walk away from clean." What she built in the years that followed was not a fortress of vindication, the way some versions of this story might have gone. It was something quieter and, to Wren, considerably more satisfying. She stepped, for the first time in her adult life, out from behind the layers of holding companies and nominee trustees that had shielded her identity for over a decade, and began running the Callaway Meridian Trust openly, under her own name, with a specific philosophy she'd developed slowly across 11 years of watching exactly what unrestricted proximity to money does to people who haven't yet been tested by its absence. She restructured the trust's investment philosophy around a single governing principle, one she'd inherited from her father, and refined through everything that had happened since. Fund the builders, not the performers. Every application for trust financing now required founders to demonstrate a track record built before any significant capital had touched their venture, evidence, in other words, that the person asking for money was the same person who had shown up to do the difficult, unglamorous work when nobody was watching and nothing was guaranteed. She also did something her father, for all his brilliance, had never quite gotten around to doing. She opened a modest fellowship program within the trust specifically for founders who, like she once had, wanted to build something and be evaluated entirely on the merits of the work itself, without their personal wealth or connections entering the equation, until the venture had already proven itself capable of standing on its own. She personally reviewed the first cohort's applications, reading each one the way her father had taught her to read a balance sheet, looking past the polish for the plain, unglamorous evidence of actual character underneath. Ashworth Capital, stripped of the invisible scaffolding that had propped it up for 9 years, limped along under new leadership for a little over a year before quietly folding into a larger competitor. Its name absorbed into a firm most of its former clients could no longer entirely remember once belonged to Julian Ashworth at all. Julian himself, according to the occasional second-hand mention that reached Wren through mutual acquaintances, she no longer particularly cared to keep, moved through a series of smaller ventures over the following years, each one carrying the particular difficulty of a man trying to rebuild a reputation in an industry with a very long, very unforgiving memory. He reached out one final time, nearly 2 years after that Thursday morning in Judge Marsh's courtroom. A brief, careful email rather than a phone call this time, asking only whether she might be willing to meet, no agenda attached, just a conversation. Wren considered it for several days before responding, and when she finally agreed, it was not out of any lingering affection, but out of a simple, settled curiosity about who, if anyone, he had actually become on the other side of losing everything he'd once assumed was permanently his. They met at a quiet cafe far from either of their old social circles, and Julian arrived looking smaller than she remembered, not physically, but in some harder-to-name way, the particular deflation of a man who has spent 2 years learning, slowly and against his own resistance, exactly how much of his former confidence had been borrowed rather than earned. "I've thought a lot about what you said," he told her, turning his coffee cup slowly without drinking from it. "About never asking who you actually were. I've had a lot of time to think about what that says about who I actually was too, and none of it makes for very comfortable thinking." He looked up. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I've earned that, and I'm not sure I ever will. I just wanted you to know that I finally heard what you said that morning, even if it took losing everything to actually listen to it." Wren studied him for a long moment, the same careful, clinical attention she'd once used to read the true value hidden underneath a manuscript's worn, unremarkable cover. "I appreciate you saying that," she said finally. "I mean that honestly. But I think the version of this conversation that would matter most isn't the one you're having with me. It's the one you still need to have with yourself, about why it took losing an empire to start asking the right questions in the first place." She stood, leaving a folded bill on the table for her coffee before he could reach for it. "I hope you get there, Julian. I really do. But I don't think I need to be in the room for it anymore." She walked out into the ordinary afternoon light of a street neither of them had ever had reason to walk down together before. And she did not look back, not out of anger, but because she had finally, entirely, finished looking back at all. 5 years after that Thursday morning in Judge Marsh's courtroom, Wren stood at a podium in a modest auditorium in Lower Manhattan, addressing the newest cohort of Callaway Meridian Fellows, a room full of founders who had been selected, every one of them, for the evidence of who they were before any significant money had ever touched their work. "People will tell you," she said, looking out at faces that reminded her, in ways she found she didn't mind, of the plain, unglamorous version of herself she'd spent a decade protecting, that the truest measure of a person is how they treat you when they need something from you. I used to believe that too. I've since learned there's a truer measure still. It's how someone treats you when they believe you have nothing at all to offer them in return. She paused, letting the room sit with that. "I spent 11 years finding out exactly what that measure reveals about people. Some of what I learned broke my heart. But it also taught me exactly who deserves to be trusted with the things I've spent my whole life building. And I promise you, it is never, ever the person laughing loudest in the room about what someone else appears not to have." After the ceremony, walking out into the late afternoon light with Priscilla, who had stayed on as both her attorney and over the years, something closer to a genuine friend, Wren paused on the steps and looked back at the building for a moment, the way she still occasionally found herself doing at the end of days that felt, in their own quiet way, like the entire point of everything that had happened 5 years earlier. "You never did tell me," Priscilla said, "whether you regret any of it. The years of hiding, letting him build a whole company on money he never knew was yours." Wren considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. "I regret that I needed to hide it all," she said finally. "I regret that the only way I ever found out who someone truly was required years of my life and a courtroom full of strangers to finally reveal it. But no, I don't regret the hiding itself. It taught me exactly what I needed to know about him, about her, and mostly, in the end, about myself." She smiled, small and genuine, and began walking toward the car waiting at the curb. "Some people spend their whole lives trying to prove how much they have. I spent mine trying to find out who would have stayed if I'd had nothing at all. I finally got my answer. It just took a judge, a folder, and one very badly timed laugh to finally say it out loud. And that is the whole story. A woman who hid a fortune to find out who she really was to the people around her. A husband who built an empire on money he never once thought to question, and lost it the moment he was finally asked to. A mistress who mocked a stranger's clothing without ever once asking who was actually sitting beneath it. And a judge who, with a single folder and a few plain sentences, reminded an entire courtroom that the truest wealth in any room is rarely wearing the loudest dress. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to remember one thing before you go. The next time you're tempted to measure someone by what they appear to have, or don't pause. You never actually know what you're looking at until the truth decides it's ready to be seen. And by then, the way you treated them along the way is already written in permanent ink. If you enjoyed tonight's story, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow and tells me you want more stories exactly like this one. And here's my question for you tonight. If you were Wren, would you have hidden your fortune for 11 years to test the people around you? Or would you have wanted the truth out in the open from the very first date? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the next story. I'll see you in the next one.